Name's Riley Hunt. Private investigator. Cheating spouses are my specialty. Rich people's problems pay my rent. And Robert Harrison's problem was about to pay for a lot more than rent. He walked into my office on a Tuesday. Forgot my name by Wednesday. By Thursday, I knew he was lying. By Friday, I understood why. 5 years of investigating unfaithful wives and cheating husbands, and I thought I'd seen every type of liar Miami had to offer. Desperate housewives, guilty husbands, manipulative mistresses. They all had tells. Nervous tics, defensive body language, stories that didn't quite add up. But Robert Harrison? He was forgetting my name every 10 minutes, and somehow that felt like the most honest thing anyone had said to me all week. When my father started forgetting my name, it broke something inside me that I didn't know could break. Jack Hunt had been a Miami PD detective for 30 years, sharp as a razor, tough as nails, never forgot a face or a case detail. By the end, he couldn't remember what he'd had for breakfast, but he still flinched when he heard sirens. Alzheimer's doesn't just steal memories, it steals the person who made those memories worth keeping. My office smelled like yesterday's coffee and broken promises, mixed with the diesel fumes that drifted up from Biscayne Boulevard 5 floors. Below, 3 filing cabinets full of other people's secrets, and now Robert Harrison was adding his to the collection. Outside, Miami's August heat was already turning the sidewalks into griddles at 9 in the morning, and the humidity made everything stick to your skin like guilt that wouldn't wash off. The air conditioning in my building had been struggling all week against the kind of heat that made asphalt shimmer like water and palm trees droop like they were melting. Even the seagulls had given up trying to fly, perching instead on whatever shade they could find while tourists wilted on the sidewalks below. "Carmen," I called to my assistant through the thin office wall, "hold my calls for the next hour." Carmen Rodriguez had been working with me for 2 years, ever since her husband died in a construction accident and left her needing a job that paid better than answering phones at medical offices. She was sharp, bilingual, and had an instinct for reading people that rivaled my own. More importantly, she'd worked in hospitals for 15 years before coming to me, which meant she knew the difference between genuine medical emergencies and elaborate performances. "You sure about this one, Riley?" she called back, her voice carrying the slight accent that made clients trust her immediately. "He looks like he might forget why he came here before you finished talking to him." "That's what I'm trying to figure out," I muttered, watching Robert Harrison through my office window as he sat in the waiting area, staring at a 3-year-old magazine like he was trying to decode ancient hieroglyphics. The guy looked like he'd lost a fight with his own reflection when he walked through my door that sweltering Tuesday morning. Expensive suit hanging loose, like he'd shrunk inside it over the past few months. Silver hair perfectly styled but somehow disheveled, as if his barber had tried to impose order on chaos. But his handshake, firm as a construction worker's. Funny how a man can forget his wife's birthday, but still remember how to project strength. My father's handshake had deteriorated early in his disease. The firm grip that had reassured crime victims and intimidated suspects became uncertain, trembling, apologetic. By the end, he couldn't shake hands at all. His motor control was too far gone. But Robert Harrison's handshake suggested muscle memory that ran deeper than whatever was supposedly affecting his mind. "Mr. Hunt? That's your name, right?" Robert said, settling into the chair across from my desk with the careful movements of someone who wasn't sure his body would cooperate. "I'm sorry, the doctors say I might have trouble remembering things." The words hit me like ice water in the Miami heat. My father had said almost exactly the same thing to me 3 years ago, sitting in a neurologist's office in Aventura, holding my hand like a child while Dr. Sarah Martinez explained that his mind was being slowly erased by a disease that had no cure and no mercy. Robert was 62 years old, According to the driver's license he fumbled out of his wallet. The address showed a waterfront mansion in Coral Gables that probably cost more than most people make in a lifetime. His business card identified him as Robert Harrison, CEO of Harrison Holdings, a construction empire I'd heard of even in my line of work. "That's right, Mr. Harrison, Riley Hunt. You called yesterday about a domestic situation?" Robert's eyes flickered with something that might have been relief, or might have been calculation. Yes, that's right. My wife, Victoria, she's been so patient with me, but lately I feel like she's waiting for something." He pulled out a manila folder with the deliberate care of someone handling evidence. Inside were medical reports from some of Miami's most expensive neurologists: Baptist Hospital, Mount Sinai, Jackson Memorial. The diagnosis was stark and unforgiving: early-onset Alzheimer's disease, progressive cognitive decline, estimated timeline 18 to 24 months before severe impairment. The papers felt heavy in my hands, heavier than they should have. I'd held similar documents about my father, watched doctors point to brain scans that showed dark spaces where memories used to live. But something about these reports felt different. Too clean, too definitive, too convenient. "Mr. Harrison, I'm sorry about your condition, but what exactly do you need from me?" "I think my wife is having an affair," he said, the words coming out in a rush, like he was afraid he'd forget them if he didn't speak quickly. "I know my memory isn't what it used to be, but I'm not stupid. Not yet, anyway." Robert's hands trembled as he reached for the medical documents, but I noticed something that made my investigator instincts start screaming. The tremor stopped when he thought I wasn't looking, like an actor dropping character between takes. My father's tremors had been constant, getting worse every day until he couldn't hold a coffee cup without spilling it all over himself and crying from frustration. "What makes you think Victoria is cheating?" "She's been different, distant. She spends a lot of time with my doctor, Dr. Reynolds. Says they're discussing my treatment options, but—" Robert paused, shaking his head like he was trying to dislodge a stubborn memory. "She looks at me differently now, like I'm already dead. My father used to say that the worst part about losing your mind wasn't the forgetting. It was watching people around you start treating you like a ghost while you were still alive. Riley," he'd told me during one of his last lucid moments, "when people think you can't understand them anymore, they start saying things they'd never say if they thought you were listening. You learn who really loves you and who's just been waiting for you to get out of their way." In my experience, when rich men started talking about being looked at like they were dead, someone usually was planning to make that a reality. "Mr. Harrison, investigating a spouse is a delicate matter under the best circumstances. Given your situation, are you sure you want to go down this road?" Robert's demeanor shifted, and for just a moment I saw something sharp and focused in his eyes, something my father had lost completely by this stage of his disease. "Mr. Hunt, I may be losing my mind, but I'm not going to lose my wife to some other man without a fight. I built Harrison Holdings from nothing. I didn't get where I am by giving up when things got difficult." The way he said it, with complete clarity and businesslike determination, made me wonder if his condition was as advanced as the medical reports suggested. My father couldn't have put together that kind of coherent strategic thought 6 months into his diagnosis. "I'll need a retainer. My daily rate is $500, plus expenses." Robert barely blinked as he wrote a check for $10,000. But as he handed it to me, I noticed his signature was perfectly steady, each letter formed with the precision of someone who'd been signing important documents for decades. My father's signature had started deteriorating early, becoming shaky and uncertain long before his other symptoms became obvious. "Mr. Harrison, one more question. How long have you been married to Victoria?" 3 years next month. We met at a charity gala for children's cancer research. She was volunteering as a nurse, helping with the medical presentations. Beautiful, compassionate, intelligent, everything a man my age could hope for in a second wife. Second wife? My first wife, Margaret, died 4 years ago. Cancer. Victoria helped me through the grief. I thought I was the luckiest man alive when she agreed to marry me. Something about the way Robert described his relationship with Victoria reminded me of how my father had talked about the nurses who'd taken care of him during his final months. Grateful, trusting, completely vulnerable to anyone who showed him kindness while his world was falling apart. After Robert left, I sat in my office reviewing what I'd learned and trying to shake the feeling that nothing about this case was going to be straightforward. The humidity from the street mixed with the stale AC in my office, creating the kind of oppressive atmosphere that made everything feel heavier than it should be. Through my window, I could see the Miami heat creating mirages on the asphalt, making the city shimmer like it was dissolving in front of my eyes. Palm trees drooped in the still air, and even the homeless guys who usually occupied the bus stop across the street had found shade somewhere else. "Carmen," I called, "what did you think of our visitor?" She appeared in my doorway, notepad in hand, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail that had survived 15 years of hospital shifts and 2 years of detective work. "Something's off about him, Riley. I've worked in medical offices. I've seen plenty of people with memory problems. That man? He remembered every detail of your fee structure, didn't ask you to repeat anything, and wrote that check like he was buying groceries." "You noticed that too?" "My grandmother had Alzheimer's. By the time she was forgetting names, she couldn't manage her own checkbook anymore." "This guy? He's playing a part." Carmen's observation confirmed what I'd been thinking, but it also raised new questions. If Robert Harrison was pretending to have Alzheimer's, why would he hire a private investigator to look into his wife's activities? What was his real game? "Carmen, I need you to run some background checks for me. Full workup on Victoria Harrison, née Miles. Employment history, financial records, social media presence, and see what you can find on Dr. Michael Reynolds, neurologist, probably affiliated with one of the big hospitals." "You got it. What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that a man who's pretending to lose his mind probably has a very good reason for wanting people to think he's helpless." While Carmen worked her magic with databases and public records, I decided to start with basic background research on Victoria Harrison. What I found painted the picture of a woman whose life had followed a very specific trajectory toward wealth and security. Victoria Miles, as she'd been known before marriage, was 43 years old and had indeed worked as a registered nurse at several Miami hospitals before marrying Robert. But her employment history showed a troubling pattern, moving from job to job every 18 to 24 months, usually leaving just before performance reviews or administrative investigations. "Riley, look at this," Carmen said, spreading printouts across my desk like she was laying out evidence for a jury. Victoria's worked at Jackson Memorial, Baptist Hospital, Mount Sinai, and Mercy Hospital. Every single time, she left just before internal investigations into missing medications or suspicious patient deaths. What kind of suspicious deaths? Elderly patients, mostly. People who were expected to recover but deteriorated rapidly during Victoria's shifts. Families filed complaints claiming their relatives' conditions got worse when Victoria was their primary nurse, but nothing was ever proven. The pattern Carmen had uncovered was disturbing, but not quite enough to prove criminal activity. Hospitals were places where people died, and nurses who worked with elderly patients inevitably witnessed more deaths than those who worked in other specialties. But the timing of Victoria's job changes suggested she'd learned to stay one step ahead of serious scrutiny. More interesting was Victoria's social media presence. Her Instagram account showed the lifestyle of a wealthy woman: expensive clothes, exotic travel, charity events, all the trappings of Miami high society. But the timeline of her posts told a different story about when the wealth had actually started. The expensive lifestyle had started exactly 3 years ago, coinciding with her marriage to Robert. Before that, her posts showed a much more modest existence: apartment living, chain restaurants, discount shopping, the kind of careful budgeting that suggested someone who was always aware of how much things cost. Looking at Victoria's transformation from struggling nurse to wealthy socialite reminded me of something my father had said about people who married for money. Riley, when someone's only experience with love comes through their bank account, they start to think that's what love actually is. They don't understand the difference between being cared for and being bought. I spent the rest of the afternoon researching Robert's business empire and financial situation. Harrison Holdings was worth approximately $50 million, with Robert as the sole owner and primary beneficiary of multiple life insurance policies worth another $10 million. If something happened to Robert, or if he was declared mentally incompetent, Victoria stood to inherit or control an enormous fortune. But as I dug deeper into the financial records, I noticed something that made my investigator instincts start screaming. Robert had been making significant changes to his accounts and insurance policies over the past 4 months, exactly around the time his supposed Alzheimer's symptoms had begun. The changes weren't the kind that someone with cognitive decline would make. They were sophisticated financial maneuvers that required complex understanding of tax law, estate planning, and asset protection strategies. Either Robert was having moments of exceptional clarity, or someone else was making these decisions for him. The next morning brought another wave of Miami's relentless summer heat. By 9 a.m., the asphalt was already shimmering like water, and the air conditioning in my car struggled against humidity that felt like breathing through wet cotton. I positioned myself across the street from the Harrison residence in an unmarked surveillance van that Carmen had helped me outfit with the latest recording equipment. The house was a testament to wealth and taste that seemed to mock the struggling neighborhoods that surrounded Miami's exclusive enclaves. Glass, marble, and steel arranged in perfect harmony overlooking Biscayne Bay, where million-dollar yachts bobbed at private docks like toys in a rich man's bathtub. The kind of place where everything looked perfect and nothing felt real, where even the landscaping seemed to whisper money with every perfectly manicured blade of grass. "Riley," Carmen's voice came through my earpiece, "I'm monitoring the house's Wi-Fi network from the office. Someone inside has been doing extensive internet searches on Alzheimer's medications, care facilities, and guardianship laws." "Can you trace which device?" "Victoria's laptop. She's been at it for 3 hours straight, and she's not looking at general information. She's researching specific protocols for having someone declared mentally incompetent." Through my telephoto lens, I watched Victoria emerge from the house at 10 a.m., driving a white Mercedes convertible that matched her perfectly styled blonde hair and designer workout clothes. She was beautiful in the way that required significant financial investment: personal trainers, cosmetic procedures, clothes that cost more than most people's monthly rent. But what struck me most was how she moved. Every gesture seemed calculated, performed for an invisible audience. Even when she was alone in her car, she maintained perfect posture and facial expressions that suggested she never stopped being aware of how she looked. Watching Victoria reminded me of something my father had said about suspects who were always on, people who never let their guard down because they were always playing a role. "The thing about cons," he'd told me during one of our last coherent conversations, "is that they can't stop performing, even when nobody's watching. They're so used to being fake that they forget what real looks like." I followed Victoria through the maze of Miami's morning traffic, past palm trees that drooped in the heat, and billboards advertising everything from plastic surgery to divorce. Lawyers. She drove with the kind of casual confidence that came from never worrying about money, stopping at red lights in air-conditioned comfort while pedestrians wilted on the sidewalks outside. But something was different about her driving today. She kept checking her mirrors, taking unexpected turns, doubling back on her route. Either she was naturally paranoid, or she suspected she was being followed. Following someone who thinks they're being followed is like trying to catch smoke with your bare hands. You have to be patient, careful, ready to back off when they get suspicious. My father had taught me that during the summer when I was 16, and he'd let me ride along on surveillance jobs. "The key to good surveillance, Riley," he'd said, "is making the target feel safe enough to do what they're planning to do." Victoria's destination was an upscale medical complex in Coconut Grove, where she spent an hour in the office of Dr. Michael Reynolds. The building was all glass and marble, designed to project an image of medical excellence that justified premium prices. Through the lobby windows, I could see elegant waiting rooms filled with expensive furniture and artwork that suggested healing came with a luxury surcharge. When Victoria emerged, she wasn't alone. Dr. Reynolds was exactly what I'd expected from his professional photographs. Tall, distinguished, with silver hair and the kind of confident bearing that came from years of being trusted with life-and-death decisions. But the way he looked at Victoria as they walked to their cars suggested their relationship involved more than medical consultations. They stood close together in the parking lot, their body language intimate in a way that had nothing to do with doctor-patient relationships. When Dr. Reynolds placed his hand on Victoria's lower back as they talked, I knew Robert's suspicions about his wife's affair were correct. I was able to photograph them together and capture part of their conversation using a directional microphone, though the traffic noise and distance made some words difficult to distinguish. "Timeline needs to be accelerated," Dr. Reynolds was saying, his voice carrying the professional authority that had convinced dozens of families to trust him with their most vulnerable relatives. "How much faster?" Victoria asked, her voice carrying none of the warmth she'd shown her husband during their brief interactions in my office. 6 months, maybe less. Robert's asking too many questions about his medications, and yesterday I caught him researching guardianship laws online. So, what do? We move to the final phase. The competency evaluation is scheduled for next week. Once that's complete, we can have Robert declared incompetent and transferred to the facility. And then? Then we wait for nature to take its course. With the right adjustments to his medication regimen, Robert won't be a problem much longer. The words made my blood run cold. In my experience, conversations about competency evaluations and medication adjustments usually meant someone was planning to steal a vulnerable person's life savings. But the casual way they discussed Robert's death suggested they were planning something much more permanent than financial fraud. Victoria and Dr. Reynolds kissed goodbye in the parking lot. Not the peck on the cheek of professional colleagues, but the passionate embrace of lovers planning a future together built on her husband's grave. As I sat in my sweltering surveillance van, watching them drive away in different directions, I felt the same sick certainty I'd experienced when I realized my father was never going to get better. But this time, the disease wasn't natural. It was being orchestrated by people who were supposed to provide care and love. The afternoon heat turned my surveillance vehicle into an oven, and I had to run the engine constantly to keep the air conditioning functioning. The sound of the compressor mixed with the distant noise of Miami traffic created a hypnotic background that made it easy to lose focus. But I couldn't afford to lose focus. Robert Harrison's life might depend on what I discovered in the next few hours. I called Carmen with an update, keeping my voice low despite being alone in the van. Carmen, I need you to dig deeper into Dr. Reynolds' background. Specifically, I want to know about other patients he's declared incompetent, what happened to their assets, and whether any of their family members had previous relationships with him. You thinking this is bigger than just Robert and Victoria? I'm thinking Dr. Reynolds might be running a systematic operation, using his medical credentials to help steal from elderly patients, and if that's true, Robert Harrison might not be his first victim. I'm on it, but Riley, there's something else you need to know. I've been monitoring the police scanners, and there was an incident at Baptist Hospital this morning. An elderly patient died unexpectedly during what was supposed to be routine treatment for dementia symptoms. What kind of incident? Medication overdose. The patient was being treated by Dr. Michael Reynolds. The coincidence was too significant to ignore. If Dr. Reynolds was using his position at Baptist Hospital to kill elderly patients while simultaneously planning Robert Harrison's murder, then we were dealing with a serial killer who used medical authority as his weapon. While Carmen worked her databases and contacts to gather more information about Dr. Reynolds' activities, I decided to take a more direct approach to understanding Victoria's plans. If she was planning to have her husband declared incompetent, she would need legal assistance to navigate the court system and handle the financial aspects of gaining guardianship. But first, I needed to understand the medical side of what I was investigating. I called Dr. Sarah Martinez, who had been my father's neurologist during the final year of his life. She was one of the few doctors who had treated my family with genuine compassion during the worst period of our lives, and I trusted her judgment about cognitive disorders more than anyone else in Miami. "Riley, Doctor," Martinez said when I called her that evening, "I remember your father fondly. He was a good man who dealt with a terrible disease with remarkable dignity. How are you holding up?" "Better some days than others. But I'm calling about a case I'm working on. I need a medical opinion about someone who might be faking Alzheimer's symptoms." "That's unusual. Can you give me the details?" I described my observations of Robert Harrison, the inconsistencies in his behavior, and the medical reports he'd shown me. Dr. Martinez listened carefully, asking occasional questions about specific symptoms and behaviors. "Riley, based on what you're describing, I'd say your instincts are probably correct. Early-stage Alzheimer's affects executive function and new memory formation, but it doesn't typically cause the kind of selective confusion you're describing. If this man can conduct complex business negotiations but can't remember your name, that's inconsistent with the normal progression of the disease." "What about the medical reports? Could those be faked?" "It's possible, but it would be difficult and risky for a doctor to falsify that kind of documentation. More likely, the patient is intentionally performing poorly on cognitive tests to create the impression of impairment. Could someone fake the symptoms convincingly enough to fool medical professionals? With enough research and practice, yes, especially if they were working with a doctor who was willing to support their deception. But Riley, why would someone want to appear to have Alzheimer's?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out, Doctor." Martinez's medical perspective confirmed my suspicions about Robert Harrison, but it also raised new questions about Dr. Reynolds's role in the situation. If Robert was faking his symptoms, was Dr. Reynolds a co-conspirator or an unwitting victim of the deception? But even as I considered the possibility that Robert was running some kind of elaborate con game, I couldn't shake the feeling that the real conspiracy involved Victoria and Dr. Reynolds planning something much more sinister than simple fraud. The answer came the next evening when I witnessed a conversation between Victoria and Dr. Reynolds that revealed the true scope of their plans and put my own life in danger. I had positioned myself in the parking garage of Dr. Reynolds' office building using a new surveillance system that Carmen had helped me install. The equipment was more sophisticated than anything I'd used before, capable of capturing both video and audio from distances that would have been impossible with older technology. Victoria and Dr. Reynolds met in the garage rather than in his office, another sign that they were trying to avoid creating records of their meetings. But they had chosen the wrong place to have their conversation. The concrete walls and ceiling of the parking garage created an acoustic environment that made their voices carry much farther than they realized. What I heard through the surveillance equipment made my blood run cold and changed my understanding of everything that had happened. "Michael, we have a problem," Victoria said, her voice tight with anxiety. "Robert's been asking questions about the medications you prescribed, and yesterday I caught him on the phone with someone talking about legal documents." "What kind of legal documents?" "I don't know, but he stopped talking when he saw me. Michael, I think he might be more aware than we thought." There was a long pause before Dr. Reynolds responded. "Victoria, even if Robert is having lucid moments, it doesn't change our timeline. The competency evaluation is scheduled for tomorrow. Once that's complete, it won't matter what Robert knows or suspects." "But what if he's been planning something? What if he's not as confused as he seems?" "Then we accelerate the final phase. I'll adjust his medication regimen tonight. By the time the evaluation happens, Robert won't be capable of coherent thought, much less organized resistance." The conversation continued with details that became increasingly disturbing. Dr. Reynolds described a cocktail of medications that would cause rapid cognitive decline, organ failure, and ultimately death. Victoria expressed concerns about the timeline and the risk of detection, but she seemed more worried about getting caught than about murdering her husband. But then I heard something that made me realize I had stumbled into something much larger and more dangerous than a simple murder plot. "Victoria," Dr. Reynolds said, his voice dropping to a whisper, "there's something else we need to discuss. I received a call this morning from someone claiming to be investigating Robert's condition. A private investigator named Hunt." My blood turned to ice. "They knew about me." "What did you tell him?" "Nothing. I didn't take the call. But Victoria, if Robert hired an investigator, that suggests a level of planning and awareness that's inconsistent with advanced Alzheimer's." "So what do we do?" "We eliminate all the variables. Robert, the investigator, anyone else who might interfere with our plan." The casual way Dr. Reynolds discussed multiple murders was terrifying. But what was more terrifying was the realization that I had become a target in a scheme that was much larger and more dangerous than I had understood. But before I could process the full implications of what I'd heard, my surveillance equipment started failing. The video feed went dead, then the audio, then even the backup recording systems. Someone had activated an electromagnetic pulse device that disabled all my electronic equipment. In my rearview mirror, I saw two men in dark suits approaching my van from behind. In front of me, Dr. Reynolds' Mercedes was blocking the exit from the parking garage. I was trapped, with no communication and no way to call for help. This was the moment my father had warned me about during his last days as a cop, when a surveillance operation turned into a survival situation. "Riley," he'd said, his mind still sharp enough to understand the dangers I might face, "if you ever find yourself outnumbered and outgunned, remember that the smart move isn't always the brave move. Sometimes the smart move is to run like hell and fight another day." I gunned the van's engine and drove straight at the Mercedes, clipping its rear bumper and sending it spinning into a concrete pillar. The two men behind me scattered as I crashed through a low barrier and into the street, where Miami traffic provided cover and confusion. My van was damaged but functional, and I managed to reach the Coral Gables police station where I could report what I'd discovered and get protection from Dr. Reynolds' associates. But as I sat in Detective Maria Santos's office that night, describing what I'd learned about the conspiracy to murder Robert Harrison, I realized that the case had become much more personal and much more dangerous than I had anticipated. Detective Santos was in her 40s, with graying hair and the kind of tired eyes that came from dealing with Miami's worst criminals for 20 years. But she listened to my story with the focused attention of someone who recognized serious criminal activity when she heard it. "Mr. Hunt," Detective Santos said after reviewing my evidence, "what you're describing sounds like a systematic operation targeting elderly people throughout South Florida. We've been investigating similar cases for months, but we haven't been able to prove the connection." "What kind of similar cases?" "Wealthy elderly men whose wives gained control of their assets through questionable competency evaluations, followed by suspicious deaths that were ruled natural causes. At least 12 cases in the past 3 years, all involving Dr. Reynolds or doctors associated with him." The scope of Dr. Reynolds' operation was larger than I had imagined, but what was more concerning was the realization that Robert Harrison might not be the mastermind I thought he was. He might be the next victim in a series of murders that had been going on for years. "Detective, we need to get to Robert immediately. If Dr. Reynolds is planning to accelerate the medication protocol, Robert could be dead within hours." But when we arrived at the Harrison residence with backup officers and paramedics, we found something that none of us had expected. The house was dark, with no signs of activity. Victoria's Mercedes was in the driveway, but Robert's car was missing. When we used Victoria's keys to enter the house, we found her unconscious in the master bedroom, apparently the victim of a drug overdose. But we didn't find Robert Harrison anywhere. "Detective," one of the officers called from Robert's study, "you need to see this." Robert's study had been transformed into a sophisticated surveillance center with computer monitors displaying feeds from hidden cameras throughout the house, recording equipment that was far more advanced than anything I had been using, and filing cabinets full of documents that appeared to be related to a complex investigation. "This isn't the setup of someone with Alzheimer's," Detective Santos observed, examining the equipment. "This is the kind of surveillance operation that would require months of planning and significant technical expertise." But the most interesting discovery was a note that Robert had left on his desk, apparently addressed to whoever found his surveillance equipment first. "If you're reading this," the note said, "then Victoria and Dr. Reynolds have attempted to implement their plan to kill me. I have been working with federal law enforcement for the past 6 months to gather evidence of a conspiracy that has resulted in at least 20 murders of elderly men throughout the Southeast. The evidence you need to prosecute everyone involved is in the safe behind the bookshelf. The combination is Margaret's birthday, 04-15-52. The truth revealed. The safe contained dozens of files documenting Dr. Reynolds' organization and its systematic targeting of wealthy elderly men. But it also contained Robert Harrison's real identity and the reason he had been willing to put himself in such danger. Robert Harrison was FBI Special Agent Robert Harrison, who had been working undercover for 8 months to expose a network of criminals who had been systematically murdering elderly people and stealing their assets. Agent Harrison volunteered for this assignment after his first wife was actually killed by this organization, Detective Santos explained after we'd contacted the FBI and learned the full scope of the operation. Margaret Harrison had been one of Dr. Reynolds' early victims, and Agent Harrison spent 2 years building a case against the people responsible for her death. The files in Robert's safe revealed that Dr. Reynolds wasn't just a single corrupt doctor. He was part of a network that included lawyers who identified potential victims, judges who expedited fraudulent competency hearings, care facility operators who isolated and killed patients, and insurance investigators who ensured that death benefits were processed quickly. The organization has been operating for at least 5 years, the FBI agent who briefed us explained. They've stolen over $30 million and killed at least 23 people that we can prove. Agent Harrison had volunteered to serve as bait for the organization after his wife's death had made him a natural target for their scheme. Working with law enforcement, he had created the appearance of being a vulnerable widower who had remarried a much younger woman with financial problems. The entire marriage to Victoria was part of the operation, the FBI agent continued. She was recruited by Dr. Reynolds 6 months before she ever met Agent Harrison, and their chance encounter at the charity gala was carefully orchestrated to make her think she was manipulating him. But the most shocking revelation was that Victoria had never been told that Robert was an FBI agent. She genuinely believed she was participating in a plan to murder a wealthy man for his money, not realizing that she was actually helping to gather evidence that would be used to prosecute her and her co-conspirators. "Where is Agent Harrison now?" I asked. "Safe house," Detective Santos replied. He extracted himself from the situation when it became clear that Dr. Reynolds was planning to accelerate the timeline. But he's been monitoring the situation and gathering evidence right up until the moment Victoria and Dr. Reynolds attempted to implement their plan. Victoria survived her apparent overdose, but only because the FBI had been monitoring the house and had called for medical assistance as soon as they detected signs of distress. She had been drugged by Dr. Reynolds as part of his plan to eliminate all potential witnesses to Robert's murder. Dr. Reynolds was arrested at Baptist Hospital while attempting to destroy evidence of his involvement in multiple patient deaths. The arrest led to a coordinated operation that resulted in the capture of 15 other people involved in the conspiracy. But the key break in the case came when we discovered Henry Foster, a 72-year-old man who had been one of Dr. Reynolds's intended victims, but had survived because his daughter had recognized the warning signs and fought back against the fraudulent competency evaluation. "Mr. Hunt," Henry said when Detective Santos brought him to my office the next day, "I heard about your investigation, and I want to help you understand what Dr. Reynolds and his people do to families like mine." Henry's story was a devastating account of medical fraud and elder abuse that made Robert's situation seem like part of a much larger pattern. 2 years ago, my wife convinced me to see Dr. Reynolds about some memory problems I'd been having. Nothing serious. I was forgetting appointments sometimes, misplacing my keys. Normal stuff for a man my age. "What happened during your evaluation?" "Dr. Reynolds did a bunch of tests, asked me a lot of questions, and then told my wife that I had early-stage dementia. He said I needed immediate medical intervention and that Eleanor should consider taking over my financial affairs to protect me from making dangerous decisions." Henry described the same progression that I'd heard Victoria and Dr. Reynolds discussing: competency evaluation, court-ordered guardianship, transfer to a care facility, and systematic isolation from family and friends. The care facility was like a prison disguised as a hospital. They controlled my medication, my visitors, my phone calls. They told my family that contact with the outside world was too stressful for someone in my condition. "How did you escape?" My daughter Sarah started asking questions about my treatment and the rapid disappearance of my assets. Eleanor had liquidated our retirement accounts, sold our house, and transferred everything to accounts that I couldn't access. Sarah hired her own lawyer and demanded an independent medical evaluation. Henry's evidence was extensive and damning. He had bank records showing payments from multiple widows to Dr. Reynolds medical records proving systematic falsification of diagnoses, and documentation of a network of care facilities, lawyers, and judges who were part of the conspiracy. "The most important thing I can tell you," Henry said, "is that Dr. Reynolds doesn't work alone. He has partners in law enforcement, the court system, and the medical community. They've been targeting wealthy elderly men throughout South Florida for at least 5 years." Henry's information provided crucial context for understanding the scope of Dr. Reynolds' operation. It also explained why Agent Harrison had been willing to put himself in such danger to expose the conspiracy. But the most satisfying moment came 2 days later, when Agent Harrison emerged from his undercover role to testify about the evidence he had gathered over 8 months of living with people who were planning to kill him. "Mr. Hunt," Agent Harrison said when we met at FBI headquarters in downtown Miami, "your independent investigation was crucial for corroborating our evidence and providing testimony that we couldn't have obtained through law enforcement channels." "Agent Harrison, how did you manage to live with Victoria for 8 months, knowing that she was planning to murder you?" "It was the hardest thing I've ever done," he admitted. "There were moments when I thought she might be developing genuine feelings for me, when I hoped that she might choose to abandon the plan and cooperate with our investigation. But she never did. She never did. Every conversation we had about our future, every moment of apparent intimacy, every expression of love, it was all part of her preparation for my murder." Agent Harrison's sacrifice had been enormous, but it had also been necessary to expose an organization that would have continued killing vulnerable elderly people indefinitely. "The evidence we've gathered will result in convictions for multiple murders, racketeering, and conspiracy charges that will put dozens of people in prison for the rest of their lives." Justice and redemption. The trials of Victoria Harrison, Dr. Michael Reynolds and their co-conspirators were among the most significant prosecutions of elder abuse in Florida's history. Victoria was convicted of conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, and racketeering. She was sentenced to 25 years in prison without the possibility of parole. During her sentencing, she continued to maintain that she had been manipulated by Dr. Reynolds and that she hadn't understood the full scope of what they were planning. Dr. Reynolds was convicted on multiple counts of murder, medical fraud, and racketeering. He was sentenced to death and is currently on death row. The investigation into his activities revealed that he had been involved in at least 23 suspicious deaths over a 5-year period. The broader investigation resulted in the arrests and convictions of 12 other people, including lawyers, care facility operators, insurance investigators, and a family court judge who had expedited fraudulent competency hearings. But perhaps the most important outcome of the case was the systematic changes it brought to how Florida handled elder abuse and competency evaluations. New laws required independent medical evaluations for all competency determinations, mandatory reporting of suspicious deaths in care facilities, and enhanced background checks for professionals who worked with elderly clients. Henry Foster testified at multiple trials, providing crucial evidence about the organization's methods and helping to secure convictions for several murders that had previously been ruled natural deaths. "Mr. Hunt," Henry said after the last trial concluded, "what you and Agent Harrison accomplished has probably saved hundreds of elderly people from becoming victims of similar schemes." Agent Harrison returned to his regular FBI duties, but maintained contact with the families of the victims and worked to establish support services for elderly people who were vulnerable to similar schemes. A new purpose. The Harrison case changed my perspective on elder abuse and the vulnerability of aging people in a society that often saw them as targets rather than treasures. Working with Agent Harrison had shown me that sometimes the people who appear most vulnerable are actually the strongest, and that intelligence and courage could overcome almost any disadvantage. But it had also reminded me of my father's real vulnerability and of the importance of protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. Carmen and I decided to specialize in elder abuse cases, working with law enforcement and social services to identify and prevent financial exploitation of elderly people. Our experience with the Harrison case had given us expertise that was badly needed in South Florida's aging population. "Riley," Carmen said as we discussed our new focus, "there are thousands of elderly people out there who are being targeted by scams, fraud, and abuse. We can use what we learned from this case to help protect them." Dr. Martinez joined our team as a medical consultant, providing expertise on cognitive disorders and helping to identify cases where elderly people might be victims of medical fraud or abuse. Henry Foster became our first client advocate, using his experience as a victim to help other elderly people recognize and resist similar schemes. "The most important message I can share," Henry told audiences at our educational seminars, "is that being old doesn't mean being helpless, and being victimized doesn't mean being defeated. With the right help and support, elderly people can fight back against those who try to exploit them." The continuing mission. 6 months after the conclusion of the trials, I received a call that reminded me that our work was far from over. "Mr. Hunt, this is Margaret Chen. I think my son is trying to have me declared incompetent so he can steal my inheritance." The voice on the phone carried the same combination of fear and determination I'd heard from Agent Harrison during our first meeting. But this time, I was prepared for the complexity of what elder abuse cases could involve. "Mrs. Chen, can you come to our office this afternoon? I'd like you to meet my team and discuss your situation in detail." "Mr. Hunt, I'm scared. My son has been telling people that I'm losing my memory, but I know exactly what he's doing and why he's doing it." Carmen had already started preparing case files, and Dr. Martinez was reviewing the medical aspects of competency evaluations and elder abuse. We had become experts in a field that was unfortunately becoming more necessary as America's population aged and predators looked for new ways to exploit vulnerable people. "Mrs. Chen," I said, "we specialize in protecting elderly people from family members who try to exploit them. We'll help you document what's happening and develop a strategy to protect your assets and your independence." Margaret Chen's case turned out to involve a different variation on elder abuse. Adult children who used emotional manipulation, financial pressure, and medical gaslighting to convince their elderly parents that they were incapable of living independently. Her son David had been systematically undermining her confidence, hiding her medications to create confusion, and telling her friends and neighbors that she was losing it and needed constant supervision. "David convinced my doctor that I was having memory problems," Margaret explained during our initial interview. "But the memory problems only happened when David was around, because he was hiding things and then asking me where they were." The case required us to use covert surveillance, medical evaluation, and psychological assessment to prove that Margaret was being manipulated rather than experiencing genuine cognitive decline. "The most insidious aspect of this type of abuse," Dr. Martinez explained, "is that it can actually cause the symptoms it claims to be treating. When elderly people are constantly told they're losing their memory, and when their environment is deliberately made confusing, they can begin to doubt their own perceptions and abilities." Margaret's case resulted in David being prosecuted for elder abuse and fraud, and in Margaret regaining full control of her life and assets. But it also showed us that elder abuse was evolving and that we needed to stay ahead of new tactics that predators were using to exploit vulnerable elderly people. As I prepared for another case involving family members who were willing to destroy their relatives for financial gain, I thought about Agent Harrison's sacrifice and about the importance of using intelligence and determination to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. Because in this business, there's always another family that needs help distinguishing between love and exploitation, always another chance to help someone who's been targeted because predators thought they would be easy. Victims. And sometimes, if the victim is smart enough and determined enough to fight back, or if they have allies who are willing to help them fight back, those predators discover that they've chosen the wrong target. My name is Riley Hunt, and Agent Harrison's case taught me that the most dangerous thing you can do to a smart person is underestimate them because of their age, their health, or their willingness to appear vulnerable while gathering evidence to destroy you. But it also taught me that the most important thing you can do for vulnerable people is help them understand that they're not as helpless as their predators want them to believe, and that intelligence, courage, and good allies can overcome almost any disadvantage. As I looked out my office window at the Miami heat shimmering off the pavement, I thought about my father one more time. He'd always said that the best detectives were the ones who remembered that every case was about real people with real problems, and that sometimes the best thing you could do for someone was help them remember that they were stronger than they thought. 3 years after the Harrison case concluded, our elder protection practice had grown into one of the most respected services in South Florida. We had helped over 300 families, prevented millions of dollars in fraud, and worked with law enforcement to prosecute dozens of criminals who preyed on elderly people. Carmen had become an expert in financial crimes against seniors. Dr. Martinez had published research on medical elder abuse, and Henry Foster had become a nationally recognized advocate for elder rights. Agent Harrison had been promoted to head a new federal task force that investigated interstate elder abuse conspiracies, and he occasionally referred cases to our practice when they required private investigation support. But the most important legacy of the case was the awareness it had created about the signs of elder abuse and the importance of protecting vulnerable elderly people from predators who saw them as easy targets. The Harrison case showed us that elder abuse is often organized crime rather than isolated incidents, Agent Harrison observed during a conference on elder protection. Fighting it effectively requires coordination between law enforcement, medical professionals, and private sector advocates who understand the specific vulnerabilities of elderly populations. The work never ends, and there's always someone else who needs help proving that being old doesn't mean being helpless, and that the best revenge against people who try to steal your life is showing them that you've been planning their destruction while they thought they were planning yours. Final reflection. As I wrote the final report on our elder protection practice's 3rd anniversary, I reflected on how much my life had changed since that sweltering Tuesday morning when Robert Harrison walked into my office pretending to have
Alzheimer's disease.
The case had forced me to confront my own grief about my father's death and my feelings of helplessness during his illness. Working with Agent Harrison had shown me that even in the face of devastating circumstances, intelligence and determination could create opportunities for justice and redemption. The phone rang as I finished writing, interrupting my thoughts about the past and bringing me back to the present. "Hunt Investigations," Carmen answered. "Elder Protection Services." "This is Detective Santos," the voice on the phone said. "We have another situation that might interest you. An elderly businessman whose family is trying to have him declared incompetent, and a doctor whose specialty seems to be helping adult children gain control of their parents' estates." I looked down at my shoes, well-maintained leather that had walked through courtrooms where justice and intelligence had learned to work together, through care facilities where vulnerable people had been protected from predators, and through the homes of families who had learned that love sometimes required vigilance. "We'll be right there, Detective," I said, reaching for my keys. Because the work never ends, and there's always someone else who needs help proving that being old doesn't mean being helpless, and that the best defense against people who try to exploit vulnerability is preparation, intelligence, and the courage to fight back.